The gavel came down at 11 minutes past 2 on a Saturday in August, and 40 oxen with clouded eyes became mine for $190 I did not have to spare. The heat inside the Perryton sale barn that afternoon sat somewhere near 104 degrees, and the dust from the pens hung in the light like something solid enough to touch. I remember the smell most, manure and sweat and the sweetish rot of the hay nobody had turned in a week, and I remember the sound the crowd made when the auctioneer waved his hand toward the back pen and said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, that here was a fine young man come to make his fortune on eyes that couldn't see the fortune coming. They laughed, not unkindly, some of them. Men I'd known my whole life, men who'd shaken my grandmother's hand at her funeral not 6 months before. But they laughed all the same, the way men laugh at a joke that costs them nothing. I was 18 years old, and I had $211 folded in an envelope in my coat pocket, which was every cent my grandmother left me, along with 320 acres of Ochiltree County dirt and a farmhouse with a roof that needed tar before winter. The oxen came through the chute in a line, 40 head, and even from the rail I could see the milk-white haze over half their eyes, the way they walked with their heads turned slightly, listening for the ground instead of watching it. Nobody bid against me. Nobody bid at all, until the auctioneer, grinning, pointed the gavel my way and asked if the young Pharaoh boy wanted to make it interesting. I don't know why I raised my hand. I have turned that over more times than I can count in the years since, lying awake with the answer just out of reach. Maybe it was pride, or grief wearing pride's clothes. Maybe it was simply that no one else in that barn was going to give those animals anything at all, and something in me, some strand of my grandmother's own stubbornness, couldn't sit still and watch that happen. The bid went up by fives, then by singles, until it stopped at $190, and it stopped because I was the only one bidding. A man 3 rows back, a wheat farmer named Orville Dietz, whose land bordered mine on the east side, laughed loud enough that I heard it clear over the auctioneer's chant, and said something about a fool and his money not staying together long in this county. I paid in cash at the clerk's window, counted out by a woman who wouldn't meet my eyes, and I signed my name on the bill of sale the way my grandmother had taught me, slow and legible, so no banker could ever say a pharaoh didn't know his own signature. What those 40 blind oxen would do to that county before the year was out, not one soul standing in that barn that afternoon could have imagined. I include myself in that. I had no idea what I had just bought, or what it would cost me, or what it would save. That was the 9th of April, 1936, though I could not have told you then how the date would come to matter, how I would turn it over in my head so many times in the years after, that it wore smooth as a creek stone. I am getting ahead of myself, and I mean to slow down, because the slowing down is the only way to tell it right. By July of 1937, the same Orville Dietz who had laughed loudest at the sale barn was standing at my east fence line on a Tuesday morning, with his hat in both hands, not on his head, asking whether I might consider letting him run 200 feet of galvanized pipe across the corner of my 12-acre field to reach the spring line. He did not call it a favor. He called it an arrangement, the way men do when they want something and don't want to owe for it out loud. Behind him, parked on the section road, sat his Ford truck with a stock tank roped down in the bed, empty, waiting. His wheat was already gone that year, burned down to nothing by the middle of June, and his well had gone to mud. I told him I'd think on it, which was true, and he nodded like a man who'd expected worse, and left without another word about fools and their money. He was not the only one. By the end of that month I had turned away 2 others, and was still turning the question over. Hollis Pruitt, from the south section, and a man named Ansel Crow, who ran cattle up toward the county line and hadn't spoken 2 words to me since my grandmother's funeral. All of them came the same way, quiet, hat in hand, looking past me at the field itself, as if the ground could explain what I couldn't. I understood the look. I'd worn it myself, once, standing in that same field, with no notion of what lay under it. But to tell it properly, I have to go back further than the auction. Back to the cold morning in January of 1936, when a neighbor woman named Beulah Ashworth knocked on my door before sunup to tell me my grandmother had not woken. I was 17 years and 11 months old that morning, and I remember the kettle was still on the stove from the night before, gone cold, and I remember thinking that was the strangest thing to notice at a time like that. Not grief, not yet, just a cold kettle, and a woman standing in my doorway with her coat buttoned wrong in her hurry to reach me. My grandmother had raised me since I was 4, after my parents were lost to a fever that took half the county that spring, and she had run that farm alone for 13 years, with nothing but stubbornness, and a Bible and a ledger she kept locked in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. I did not know yet what was written in that ledger, or in the older one hidden above it in the attic rafters, wrapped in oilcloth and older than she was. The funeral cost $61, which Reverend Tolliver at the Ochiltree Methodist Church took in cash on a Tuesday and did not haggle over, and the First State Bank of Ochiltree County took the rest against what my grandmother owed on a note she'd signed back in 1931 to buy seed and a second-hand McCormick Deering after a hailstorm took the wheat. When the man behind the desk, a thin fellow named Corwin Aldis with a green banker's visor he never seemed to take off, finished his figuring, he slid a paper across to me and said there was $204 left to my name, and the farm besides, 62 acres of it, free and clear of any lien but that one, now paid. 62 acres does not sound like much to a man who has never had to feed anything off it, but it was 50 acres of wheat and grazing ground my grandmother had worked since before I was born, and 12 acres more that nobody worked at all. That 12-acre field sat at the northwest corner of the property, flat as a plate and green in spring same as anywhere else, and my grandfather, who died the year I turned 4, the same year that took my parents, had fenced it off early in his life and never once put a plow to it. My grandmother kept the fence mended after he was gone, but she never explained why, and when I asked her as a boy, she only said some ground wasn't meant to be woke up, and went back to her churning. I had heard men in town call it cursed, the way men will call anything they don't understand cursed, and I had heard old Beulah Ashworth herself say once that a cow got into it in 1919 and dropped dead within the week, though nobody could say from what. I did not believe in curses. I believed, at 17 years and 11 months old, standing in Corwin Aldis's office, with $204 folded in my coat pocket, that ground was ground, and that a man too poor to plant 50 acres properly had no business worrying over 12 he wasn't touching anyway. But I did not plow it that spring. I had wheat to get in the ground on the 50 acres I did have, and a farm to learn to run by myself, and I did not think of the 12-acre field again until the day, 3 months later, that a Perryton auctioneer named Dutch Renfro stood 40 half-blind oxen in a ring in front of the whole county and asked who'd take them off his hands, and I raised my own before I understood what I was doing. Corwin Aldis had asked me to sit down twice before I did it, and when I did, he folded his hands on the desk like a man about to pray over a meal he didn't much care for. He was First State Bank's only loan officer in those days, a heavy man with a gold tooth on the left side that showed when he talked, and he told me, not unkindly, that a boy of 17 had no business trying to run 400 acres alone, blind field or no blind field. He said Otto Kessler had already come to him twice asking about the North 80, and that Kessler was a fair man who'd give me a decent price and let me stay on as a hired hand if I wanted. Steady wages, a roof, no more worrying over notes coming due. He said it the way a man says something he has said 100 times to 100 different families, and I understood he believed he was doing me a kindness. I told him I meant to keep the place. He looked at my $204 sitting on the desk between us, the whole of what my grandmother left after the funeral costs and the back taxes were paid, and he said that wouldn't buy me a season's seed corn and a decent mule, let alone carry a farm through till harvest. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. I shook his hand anyway and told him I'd think on Kessler's offer, which was a lie, and I drove the truck 22 miles to Perryton that Saturday, not to sell anything, but to see what a man could buy with what little he had left. Dutch Renfro had 40 oxen in the ring by noon, culls from a Kiowa County outfit that had gone under, half of them with a milk-white film starting over their eyes, walking crooked, bumping the rail. Somebody in the crowd asked if he was selling meat or misery. Renfro laughed along with them, said he'd take whatever a man was fool enough to offer, and I raised my hand before I'd worked out in my head what I meant to do with 40 animals that couldn't see where they were going. The bidding went nowhere fast. Men calling out numbers meant to be jokes. $5, $3, a dime a head, and Renfro pointed at me standing there with my hand still up and said, "Well, boy, looks like you're bidding against yourself." I said $200 for the lot. The whole barn went quiet, and then it didn't. Somebody let out a whoop like I'd said something in Dutch, and a man near the rail told his neighbor, loud enough for me to hear, that Beulah Farrow's grandson had gone soft in the head, same as that field of hers. And the laughing after that didn't stop until Renfro brought the gavel down and made it mine. Thursday, the 9th of July, 1937, and the heat had a weight to it that made the air look bent over the road. I was cutting a second stand of alfalfa off the 8 acres below the spring line when I saw the truck coming, a '29 Ford with one fender gone to rust, throwing dust a half-mile before it ever reached my gate. It was Del Ashworth, who ran 300 acres north of the county road, a man who'd stood at that sale barn in '36 and laughed loud enough that I remembered his voice particular among all the others. He didn't look like a man who laughed easy now. His shirt hung on him the way clothes hang on a fence post, and he sat in that truck a full minute before he climbed down, like he was deciding whether the errand was worth the shame of it. He said his stock tank had been dry since the last week of June. Said he'd hauled water from the Canadian riverbed twice already, what there was of it, brown and thick and not fit for much, and his cattle were losing weight he couldn't afford them to lose. He didn't ask me straight out. He stood at the fence looking past me toward the field, where my herd grazed green grass in the middle of a summer that had turned the rest of the county the color of a paper sack. Panhandle Milling had already cut credit to half the farms south of the tracks, he said, on account of nobody could pay for feed with nothing coming in. The Hendersons had sold their team. The Coopers had a man from the bank out twice in June, walking the fence line with a clipboard like he was pricing a corpse before it was cold. Dell said it plain, not unkind, just tired. 3 farms he could name were done, finished, and it wasn't but the middle of July. I didn't say much. I let him talk himself around to it, the way Elmer had taught me to let a nervous animal come to the rope on its own time, rather than have it dragged. Dell finally said he'd heard I had water on my place that hadn't gone dry, and was it true, and could a man maybe pay something reasonable to run a line off it for his own stock, just enough to keep from losing what he had left. I told him I'd think on it. That was all I said, and he nodded like it was more than he'd expected, climbed back into that Ford, and left a column of dust standing in the road behind him long after the truck itself was gone from sight. And I stood at the fence a long while after that, looking at the field where the blind team was working the ground, same as they had the summer before, thinking about the sound 40 men made laughing at once. The sound of that laughing carried me back to the sale barn a year before it, to the morning after, when the whole county had gone home satisfied with the joke, and I was left standing in a lot full of animals nobody wanted, holding a lead rope with nothing to show for $200 but 40 pairs of clouded eyes. I remember the dust of that morning too, the way it hung different from Dell's dust, thicker, closer to me, because I was standing right in it, instead of watching it settle down a road. Elmer had come out before sunup, before I'd even had coffee, and stood at the fence looking at what I'd bought, like a man reading a letter he already half expected the contents of. He didn't laugh. That was the first thing I noticed. That the not laughing was its own kind of statement in a county where everybody else had already made up their mind. He walked into the lot slow, the way you'd walk toward something wild, though there wasn't a wild thing left in those oxen, just tired and dark and unable to see the fence they were standing against. He put his hand flat on the near one's shoulder, the one I'd later name Abraham, and said something low in a language I didn't know, and the ox didn't startle, just turned its head toward the sound, the way a man turns toward a voice he trusts in a dark room. He told me that day, without much preamble, that his own father had worked blind mules on a freight line out of the territory before statehood, and that a blind animal wasn't a ruined animal, only an animal that had to be told the truth instead of shown it. He said sighted stock get lazy, let their eyes do the thinking, but a blind team, worked right, would listen to a man's voice like scripture, because it was all they had to go on. He started that same morning, walking the lot with a coil of rope and no hurry in him at all, teaching me the calls before he taught the oxen. G and haw same as any team, but softer, more of them, a whole vocabulary of small sounds, for stop and start and step and easy, that most drivers never bothered to use because their animals could just see the ditch or the stump coming. I asked him once, weeks in, why he'd stayed on the place so long, 20-some years by then, working for wages that never amounted to much. He didn't answer right off. He coiled the rope in his hands and looked out at the field my grandfather never plowed, and said only that some ground remembers who's kind to it, and some men do too, and he'd been paid enough of both to keep him satisfied. That satisfied is a word I turned over for years after, because it never once sounded like a complaint to me, only like a man who'd made his peace with a wage that didn't match his worth, and decided the peace was worth more than the wage. I didn't press him further that day. I had the attic waiting on me, and a roof over it that leaked in one corner every time it rained, which is why I was up there at all, on a Tuesday, in late June of 1936, laying a scrap of tin across the worst of the boards, before the next storm came through off the Canadian breaks. That's where I found the trunk. Cedar, black iron hinges gone to rust lace, my great-grandmother's initials, EMF, burned crooked into the lid by somebody who wasn't practiced with a hot iron. Inside it, under a folded wedding dress gone the color of weak coffee, was the ledger. Leather cover, cracked down the spine, the kind of book a woman keeps when she's the only one left to keep the accounts. Her hand was small and slanted, and pressed hard enough into the page that I could feel the words on the backside of the paper like braille. She wrote about breaking sod in 1891 with a team of mules and a plow her husband bought on credit before he died of a fever that same winter, leaving her 26 years old, with 3 children and 480 acres of panhandle grass she had never asked for and would not let go of. She wrote about drought years before this one, about a well that ran dry in 1899, and a winter she fed cattle cottonseed hulls because there was nothing else, about neighbors who told her a widow woman had no business holding land a man couldn't work either. I read that page twice. Near the back, dated November of 1911, the ink darker, the hand less steady, she wrote about a flood that came down off the caprock in 3 days of rain and took the old spring house clean off its footing, and how the water that had run through her land since before the first plow ever touched it went somewhere under the 12-acre field and did not come back up. Below the entry was a map, drawn crude but careful, a square marked off with pacing steps from the corner post, and at its center, a single word underlined twice. Sealed. I sat with that trunk open in the heat of the attic a long while, tin patch forgotten in my hand, listening to Elmer's voice still calling G, real soft, out across the lot below, and I understood for the first time that the field my grandfather had spent his whole life walking around wasn't cursed at all. It was only waiting on somebody willing to dig. I brought the ledger down that evening, and read it by lamplight at the kitchen table, where she used to shell peas. And Elmer sat across from me, the way he always did when there was talk that mattered. Hands folded, not reaching for the book, because his eyes had gone too dim for close reading years back. I read him the flood entry twice. He nodded slow, like a man confirming something he'd carried a long time and never had cause to say out loud. Land company came through here in '09, he said. Fella named Reese Coulter, out of Amarillo, buying water rights ahead of the railroad spur they figured to run north. Told your great-grandmother the spring wasn't worth fighting for, that a woman alone couldn't hold ground against men with lawyers. He picked at the table edge with one thumbnail. She held it anyway. Wouldn't sign nothing. Coulter come back 3 times that I recall, each time with a bigger number and a smaller smile. She win? She kept the water in the family name. That's all winning ever is, out here. He was quiet a moment, and the lamp hissed low. Then the flood took it under, before anybody got the good of it. I always figured that was God's idea of a joke. I asked him why my grandfather never once mentioned Coulter, never mentioned the fight at all, only ever called the field bad ground, and let the milkweed have it. Elmer's face didn't change much, but something behind it did. Your grandfather was 7 years old, the November that water went under. He was down there playing at the spring house when the bank gave way. Pulled him out half drowned. His mother never let him near that corner of the field again, and he never asked her why, and by the time he was a grown man asking, would have meant admitting he was still scared of a place. He shook his head. Wasn't a curse, Silas. Wasn't superstition, neither. It was a boy who near drowned, and a mother who couldn't bear to watch it happen twice. And then it was just a habit nobody ever broke. I sat with that. 40 years of a family walking a wide circle around 12 acres, because a boy had been frightened once, and nobody after him had the nerve, or the reason, to ask why. He never told you outright? Didn't have to. I dug his mother's grave. I know what grief looks like when it's been let alone too long. He turned his face toward the window, toward the dark shape of the barn, where the blind team stood shoulder to shoulder, in the last of the day's warmth. That ground's not cursed, boy. It's just been grieved on so long, everybody forgot there was water under the sorrow. I closed the ledger soft, like it might still wake somebody, and I understood that the field wasn't waiting on a fool with a plow. It was waiting on somebody who hadn't been there the day the water went under. Monday morning, we hitched the team before light, and I will remember the sound of it longer than I remember most things I've seen with my own 2 eyes. 40 hooves finding ground they couldn't see, guided by a rope and a voice, moving into a field that had sat idle since before my father was a name anybody said out loud. He walked the near side, I walked the off, and between us ran the lines, doubled through the hames the way he'd shown me 3 weeks running, until my hands knew the tension without my head having to ask. "Gee," he called, soft, not sharp, and the lead pair swung right, like they'd heard a bell only they could hear. The plow was my grandfather's, a 2-bottom John Deere he'd bought second-hand in 1919 and never once run on this ground, and the share bit into soil that hadn't turned since Grover Cleveland was a fresh memory to somebody's grandmother. We went slow, slower than I wanted, slower than made sense to a boy in a hurry, but he'd told me speed was for men who could see where they were going. And we weren't those men. Not that morning. Not with that team. Row 1 came up dark and rich, no different from any other field on the place. And I remember feeling almost cheated by how ordinary it looked. 12 years of family avoidance for dirt, the same color as everything else we owned. Row 2 the same. Row 3, the ground rose a little, stone showing pale under the turned earth, like a knuckle under skin. And he called the team down to nearly nothing, walking them so slow I could hear my own boots in the stubble. "Easy," he said, and I didn't know yet if he was talking to the oxen or to me. By noon we'd broken maybe 2 acres, which was nothing, which was an insult to a normal day's work with a sighted team. But he wouldn't hurry it. Not for dinner, not for daylight running short, not for the ache climbing up through my shoulders, from holding lines all morning. We stopped to water the team at the trough by the fence line, and he stood a long while, looking back over the rows we'd cut, not saying anything. The way a man looks at a letter, he isn't sure he wants to finish reading. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go past the rise." I asked him what was past the rise, and he only pointed with his chin toward a shelf of pale rock, breaking the soil like a scar, half-buried, patient, waiting the way the whole field had been waiting, and told me to get some sleep, because tomorrow the ground would fight back. The rock came up out of the ground the way a tooth comes up out of a jaw that doesn't want to give it, slow, and then all at once. I heard it before I understood it, a groan under the share, low, almost like something breathing, and the led pair, Duke and Caesar, threw their heads back against the yoke, though there was nothing in front of them their clouded eyes could have seen to spook at. Elmer's voice didn't change. That was the thing I remember clearest, clearer than the sound itself. "Hold," he said, just that, the same flat, unhurried word he'd used all morning to walk them through stubble, and the team held, straining, their hooves cutting into the dirt for purchase, muscles standing up along their necks like rope pulled taut. The blade had caught on the limestone shelf, the pale scar Elmer had pointed to with his chin the evening before, and instead of riding up over it the way I expected, it dug in at an angle, wedged, and the whole plow shuddered under my hands like something alive and objecting. I called out to loosen the lines, some instinct in me saying stop, back off, but Elmer said no, short, certain, and told the team to lean, just that word, lean, in the tone a man uses for something he trusts completely. They leaned. I felt it through the handles before I heard it, a shift somewhere under the ground, deep, a give that didn't belong to plowed earth. Then the crack came, sharp, a single report like a green branch snapping, and the shelf split along a seam that must have been waiting on it since before I was born, since before my father was born. Water came up through that seam the way blood comes up through a cut, not a trickle, not a seep, but a rush, brown first, then clearer, spreading fast across the broken furrow, catching the noon light in a way that made no sense to me, because there was no water in that field. There had never been water in that field, not in my lifetime, not in my grandfather's stories, not in anything anyone living had ever said out loud. I stood there with the lines still in my hands and didn't move. The oxen didn't spook, didn't bolt, just stood with their sides heaving, patient, the way blind things learn to be patient, water rising cold around their hooves. Elmer stepped down into it without hesitation, boots and all, put his palm flat against the wet limestone like he was checking the pulse of something, and looked back at me across the running water with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like meeting someone he'd been expecting for a long time. "Well," he said, "there it is." By the second week of August 1936, the spring had cut its own channel down through the 12 acres and into the low pasture, and I had rigged a trough off it with pipe salvaged from the old windmill, works my great-grandmother's husband put up before he died. The rest of the county went the color of a burnt match. I rode into Perryton on a Saturday and saw the Ochiltree County Courthouse thermometer reading 111 degrees, and men standing under the awning of the feed store not buying anything, just standing, because Panhandle Milling and Feed Co. had raised prices twice that month, and nobody had money for the first price, let alone the second. The Dunmore place went first, foreclosed by First State Bank in September. The family gone to California in a truck loaded so high the tarp split on the county road. Then the Whitfield spread. Then old man Case's 80 acres that had been in his family since statehood. 3 farms within 6 miles of mine, gone dry, gone under, gone west. My 12 acres stayed green into November. That was when the visits started. Ray Coble came first. The same man who'd stood at the sale barn rail in April, laughing loud enough that I'd heard him over the auctioneer's chant. And now he stood in my yard, turning his hat in his hands. asking careful and polite whether I might consider letting him run a pipe off my spring for his cattle. Said he'd pay whatever was fair. I told him he could run it, and I'd take a fee for the right-of-way. But the water stayed mine, the way the ground stayed mine. He didn't argue. Then it was Vernon Atkins. Then 2 brothers named Suggs I barely knew. Then a rancher from Clearover in Lipscomb County who'd heard the story secondhand and driven 40 miles to hear it confirmed. I found out later, going back through my great-grandmother's ledger by lamplight one night in December, that she'd written near about the same arrangement in 1904, before the flood ever came. Pipe rights granted, ownership held, the water never sold outright, only shared, because she'd written that a family that sells its water sells the reason anyone remembers its name. I hadn't known that when I told Ray Coble no. I'd said it like it was my own idea. Elmer, when I told him, only nodded like it wasn't news to him at all, like he'd been waiting to see if I'd land there on my own, the way you wait to see if a colt will find its feet without being pulled up by the halter. He went that January, on a Tuesday, the kind of cold that cracks the water trough by morning. I found him in the bunkhouse with his boots still on, like he'd meant to get up and hadn't. Doc Ferris from town said his heart just quit, the way an old engine quits. Not from any one thing, but from all the years of things together. He'd told me once, riding the fence line that past October, that when his time came he didn't want the church plot in town, didn't want a box shipped in from Perryton with brass handles. He wanted the rise above the 12-acre field, where he could hear the water, if a dead man could hear anything at all. I buried him there myself, with help from Vernon Atkins and one of the Suggs brothers, in ground that had never been broken before, and I set a field stone at the head of it because that was what he would have wanted, no name carved, just the stone, the way his own people had marked ground, long before Ochiltree County had a name on any map. The second harvest came in that fall of 1937, better than the first, and I never once let anybody talk me into swapping out the blind team. Sam Garrett offered me 2-sided mules for the whole lot of them, in the spring of '38, and I told him no, the same way I'd told Ray Coble no about the water. Those oxen worked until they couldn't, one dying in the winter of '39, 2 more the year after, and the last of them, an ox I'd named Abraham because he was the oldest and the steadiest, died in the spring of 1941, in the same 12-acre field he'd cracked open with his own blindness, and his own trust in a rope and a voice he couldn't see. I buried him close to where the plow first struck stone, because it seemed like the only honest place. The county doesn't call it the cursed field anymore. Folks call it the Faro Spring, and there's pipe running off it to 4 farms besides my own, and none of it ever changed hands for money, not once, not to this day. I think about that auction some mornings, standing at that same rail with my hat pushed back, and about how a whole crowd of grown men figured a boy with $200 and no sense was about the funniest thing they'd seen all season. I don't hold it against them anymore. I've just noticed that the men who laugh loudest at a young man's judgment are usually the ones who never once knelt down to look closely at anything themselves. There's likely a ledger in your own family's attic, or a tool with initials worn into the handle, that nobody's opened in 40 years. If you've got a story like that, I'd like to hear it in the comments. And if this one was worth your time, stay close. There's more where this